I watch all my videos at 2 times the speed.
Hello everybody, today we're going to be talking about a new book, After the Apocalypse, by Andrew Bacevich, I guess. Bacevich? And this is another amazing book, and it has a really post-apocalyptic perspective, which is why we're looking at it. Now, Andrew Bacevich's main goal here is to talk about the United States and this idea of American exceptionalism. But that's not our focus. Our focus is on the amazing Bacevich methodology, which somehow ironically aligns very closely with the methodology I have in the subreddit r/CYBERPHUNK with the PH. This is a post-apocalyptic perspective, the idea that the apocalypse has already happened. That's why the book is called After the Apocalypse. And you can see that the methodology that Andrew Bacevich is using is very similar, independently of what I've come up with in my Carrying Over the Burdens of Trace text. If you haven't looked at my thesis paper, the one that I'm trying to basically help the world understand these kinds of ontotheological aspect of ritual and how our rituals create our kind of reality. So we're going to be reading this book, and then I'm going to be doing an analysis of it as it shows up in the Real News with Chris Hedges. Now, Chris Hedges have been doing some really good work in the last couple months. It was actually in the last year with the Real News. The Chris Hedges has been doing really good work. I mean, when I was younger, I didn't really like Chris Hedges, but now I think that Chris Hedges is really doing a great job. Chris Hedges, Glenn Greenwald, actually there's a bunch of these. Matt Taibbi, if you're not following up on the Twitter situation right now, I've been quite busy debating with fascists on the internet since Twitter opened up, and I absolutely revel in it, and I love it. It's much better than the censorship culture that the intersectional left has created, the censorship culture that unfortunately helps fascism brew in the corners of our collective consciousness. Fascism can grow if we don't address it. The cancerous ideologies grow when we don't address it, especially when we have another form of tribalism, left-wing tribalism, as we've been talking about here, the kind of tribalism that gives heed or bows to neoliberal ideologies. Neoliberal ideologies, if you're not following up on my channel, is that the idea of standpoint epistemology is completely within the neoliberal framework, the same ideology that has excommunicated people like Hannah Arendt and has been allowing for fascism to brew without caring, while saying it's too much emotional labor. Well, unfortunately, we live in a democracy, and the more these left-wing people point to everything they're scared of and call it right-wing, the more the right-wing is growing. It's a very much more complicated story than the mainstream story that we are enforced intersectionality perspective that I've been railing against for the last like many years, okay, and I've been canceled for it and excommunicated from my left-wing circles because of these ideas, these enforced hive mind mentality that is just destroying any possibility of solidarity, and in fact growing both the neoliberal and the right wing, which is both very scary. And as we know, every failed revolution, every fascist coup is a failed revolution. Reading this book and interjecting as we go along, and then afterwards we're going to be doing a interjection of the Andrew Bacevich with regards to the Real News and Chris Hedges. So thank you for taking the time. Our war, up to the very end, was a war of old men, or of theorists who were bogged down in errors engendered by the faulty teaching of history. It was saturated by the smell of decay. Mark Bloch, strange defeat. Now again, this person's main goal is to deal with the American exceptionalism. And he starts with the quote, "Not so innocent." And that's a Donald Trump quote, right? He's saying, "You think we're so innocent? You think we're so innocent?" So that's a interesting perspective to look at. So, old, new, next. In the midst of the coronavirus pandemic, Pope Francis told an interviewer, "We need to recover our memory because memory will come to our aid." Such pontifical advice finds application well beyond his own flock. Recovering from the ill effects of American exceptionalism will entail remembering things most Americans would rather forget. The history that shapes our political consciousness, and therefore legitimates the use of U.S. military and economic power, consists almost entirely of selectively remembered events. And while we choose to remember carefully curated to remove or conceal unbecoming details, it may be convenient. The results come nowhere near to offering a complete and accurate record of the past. From the very beginning of the Trump presidency, journalists entertained themselves and their readers by tallying up the 45th president's vast accumulation of half-truths, untruths, and outright lies. Trump was unquestionably a congenial dissembler. Yet, when it comes to the use of U.S. power to further the nation's ambitions, Americans have long since made their peace with half-truths, untruths, and lies on a recognizably Trumpian scale. And that's it. Wonderful. Pointing out the hypocrisy that fuels the Trump presidency, the hypocrisy of the Democratic left, the real neoliberal left, the obviously neoliberal left, compared to the neoliberal left that I'm talking about, which is even farther on the left than that. They don't think of themselves as neoliberal. This is just the Democratic liberals. Going back at least far as the President Andrew Jackson's expulsion of the Cherokees from the ancestral lands, dissenters have denounced this habit of officially disassembling to little avail. In 1836, the chief of the Cherokee Nation wrote Congress to protest the forced eviction of his people from their lands. In an eloquent letter, Chief John Ross pleaded that such an act of injustice and oppression could never knowingly be countenanced by the government and people of the U.S. Yet it was knowingly countenanced with a minimum of regret that was without practical effect. A decade later, Thomas Corwin of Ohio took to the floor of the Senate to decry the ongoing U.S. war with Mexico, undertaken with a hypocritical pretense, devised to conceal the avarice which prompted us to covet and to seize by force that which was not ours. Corwin felt certain that eventually the truth would come out. Whatever we may say today, he insisted, or whatever we may write in our books, the stern tribunal of history will review it all, detect falsehood, and bring us to judgment. In reality, once California and the Southwest were ours, Americans wasted no time in making peace with their hypocritical pretense. At the end of the 19th century, hypocritical pretense found expressions even further afield, sending Mark Twain into a fit of outrage. The annexation of Philippine archipelago, seized in a war ostensibly undertaken to liberate Cuba, which was a false pretense in itself, prompted him to revise the lyrics of the battle hymn of the Republic. Mine eyes have seen the orgy of the launching of the sword. Here is out the hoarding where the stranger's wealth is stored. He hath loosed his fateful lightnings with woe and death has scored. His lust is marching on. After an estimated 200,000 Filipinos, U.S. forces succeeded in pacifying the Philippines. Twain's ditty was soon forgotten. I cite these distance episodes in the Chronicle of American Exceptionalism to make a larger point. Our collective capacity for misremembering or altogether forgetting inconvenient facts is bottomless, and plays a crucial role in sustaining American exceptionalism. Available yet inert, such inconvenient facts may attract occasional notice, from time to time even cause twinges of remorse, Who can feel good about the fate of Americans, Native Americans suffered at the hands of the US government? All the people on Twitter. Soon enough, however, such facts filed away under the heading of not especially relevant, and the myths of Americans as gods, new chosen people, survives with hardly a scratch. Now you can see that he's pointing out to another problem as well at the same time. Another very similar country with a very similar myth. In the final analysis, only facts that sustain a belief in American exceptionalism count. To illustrate how this works, consider an essay that Joe Biden published in Foreign Affairs just as the coronavirus pandemic of 2020 began to bite. Carrying the predictable title, Why America Must Lead Again, the essay conveyed the former vice president's foreign policy vision just as he was mounting his run for the White House. Although it appeared that in the wake of the 2-decade period during which American leadership had produced less than reassuring results, Biden did not tarry over mistakes. For example, he made absolutely no mention of 2003 invasion of Iraq, which, as chair of the Foreign Senate Relations Committee, he had ardently supported. Instead, the would-be commander-in-chief offered a something-for-everyone potpourri of promises touching on subjects ranging from trade and climate change to fighting corruption abroad and lifting up women and girls around the world. Prominently featured in his smorgasbord were assurances of his willingness to use force if need be, and a vow that the United States would continue to possess the strongest military in the world, as if a reluctance to employ violence or a shortfall in available striking power had somehow hampered recent U.S. policy. And again, this is something that we're talking about since the medieval ages. The defense of certain vulnerable peoples are used to basically conquer lands. Unpacking Biden's foreign policy vision requires giving due attention to his cliches trotted out to clinch his argument. History itself, he insisted, validated that vision. This is not a moment of fear, echoing Franklin Roosevelt's first inaugural address. This is the time to tap the strength and audacity that took us to victory in 2 world wars and brought down the Iron Curtain. Everybody remembers that speech. The triumph of democracy and liberalism over fascism and autocracy created the free world. But this contest does not define our past. It will define our future as well. That's actually a famous speech now. Here, in a nutshell, in a narrative that props up American exceptionalism, the conviction that a succession of victories engineered by the US had created the free world, thereby weaving past, present, and future into a single, seamless garment. That this narrative cannot withstand even minimally critical scrutiny is besides the point. Does the outcome of World War I qualify as a victory, or did it pave the way for something worse? And didn't Soviet leader Stalin, neither democratic nor liberal, somehow figure in defeating fascism in World War II? Biden's framing of history excluded all that happened before 1914 and after 1989, while airbrushing more than a little of what happened in between. By depicting history as a story of America rising up to thwart distant threats, he captured the essence of the past to which establishment politicians, that is, everyone except someone like Donald Trump, still instinctively revert in stump speeches or on patriotic occasions. My late mother, a devout pro-Catholic and a proud veteran of World War II, would have never voted for Joe Biden, and certainly not for Clinton, whom she despised. Yet my mother would have thoroughly approved of their take on the role that America had played in recent history. After all, she lived through that history. Nothing that had encountered from her birth in the 1920s through the Depression, Global War, and Cold War to her death, not so long after her grandson was killed in Iraq, had caused her even a shadow of doubt. She too fervently believed that America is great because America is good. And now we know his son died in Iraq. So, what's he talking about? This American exceptionalism that sent his son to die in a fruitless, pointless war. Old order, new order, next order. But are the events that defined my mother's life still pertinent? Should those events define the lives of her children's grandchildren? Or is it possible that we are living now in a completely different time? Perhaps the only good thing about the brush with the apocalypse is that it invites us to address the questions head on. Arthur Schlesinger Jr. was as much a political operative as a prize-winning historian. His scholarly reputation rests primarily in the multi-part Age of Roosevelt, the first volume of which, The Crisis of the Old Order, in 1957, Schlesinger's telling the disappointing outcome of the European War of 1914 to 1918. Few Americans during the 20s and 30s regarded it as much of a victory. When combined with the Great Depression, spelled the demise of the old order, which Schlesinger portrayed as suffering from terminal exhaustion. Fatigued with the higher idealism and according to Schlesinger had defined in the progressive era, Americans after the World War embraced an ethos of normalcy. In his telling, normalcy meant conformity, complacency, and deference to devotees of business cults. The prevailing national mood was drab, dull, predictable. Schlesinger compared it to life in a sleepy Midwestern town. The shady streets, the weekly lodge meetings, golf on Sunday morning, followed by a fried chicken dinner and an afternoon nap. Beginning in 1933, Schlesinger spins the New Deal along with Franklin Roosevelt's inspiring leadership in the triumphal Second World War, inaugurated in a new war order that was vigorous, enlightened, and progressive. Schlesinger portrayed its domestic politics as pitting stodgy conservatives against forward-looking liberals. What actually distinguished his new order was a sublime ideological clarity. I wonder if he is aware of Zizek's work, The Sublime Subject of Ideology or something. An era defined internationally by conflicts pitting democratic capitalism against various forms of totalitarianism was all about choosing sides. The new order did not encourage doubts. Of course, that's comes from Kant and comes from Freud, so the sublime subject of ideology. It's older than Zizek himself, but this guy's well read. Much as FDR played a key role in creating that order, it fell to the Cold War presidents of Truman and Reagan to sustain it. Not all of them enjoyed equal success in doing so, yet leading the free world defined the standard by which we are all judged. Even after the fall of the Berlin Wall in 1989, the standard remained intact. During the post-Cold War, Presidents Bill Clinton, George W. Bush, and Barack Obama sought to keep the new order alive, even if from time to time that meant putting it in a figurative ventilator. Despite a long train of shocks, including the bursting of the 1998 dot-com bubble, a court-brokered presidential election in 2000, 9/11 attacks, the futile global war on terrorism, the devastation inflicted by Hurricane Katrina 2005, Great Recession in 2007 and 2008, not to mention the rise of Donald Trump. Political elites clung to their belief in the new order. Across America, once preeminent denominations of mainline Protestantism might be in a tailspin, but in Washington, faith that God had singled out the U.S. as his instrument of salvation remained fixed in place. That the parable of Schlesinger had conjured up, and this is a good point, that's the beginning of his ontotheological perspective, which is why I'm so interested in this work. The fact that he realizes that we have no choice but this kind of religiosity perspective. He talks about how we need kind of a historical revisionism, but the historical revisionisms that we get from whatever popular narrative, whether it's supposedly the fake anti-neoliberal intersectional perspective or this kind of historical revisionism that we get as he's spelling it out in terms of American exceptionalism, all of these are problematic. At the same time, he notices that we almost can't do without historical revisionism. So the question is, what kind of historical revisionism do we want to do? So he understands this religiosity aspect in creating a history, this narrative aspect of creating a history. That's the methodological point that is really incredible in this. And that methodological point is not so simple. I wrote a really long paper about that point, right? It's called Carrying Over the Burdens of Trace. That's why I love this work. That the parable of Schlesinger had conjured up its essentials affirmed by the countless other writers since, hovers in the background of Biden's foreign affairs essay of 2020 is then hardly surprising. Even as I write this, the American political establishment, Trump himself always excluded, clings to the illusion that in some cosmic sense, the moral and geopolitical outlook to which Americans implicitly subscribed to between 1945 and 89 remains fully relevant. Within days of his election to the presidency, Biden himself was assuring foreign leaders that America is back, that the conditions imparting the period its characteristic vibe have long since vanished somehow manages to escape notice. Belief that the United States is still in charge of the lead and leading the free world against the forces of darkness lingers. At the outset of the post-World War II era, with the most of Europe and much of Asia laid waste by U.S., undamaging and all but self-sufficient, American economic and technological supremacy was indisputable. Sole possession of nuclear weapons guaranteed U.S. military preeminence as well. The shattered and demoralized nations of Western Europe desperately needed American aid and protection. Even former Axis powers, Germany, Italy, and Japan, looked to Washington for assistance. In the Far East, China was weak and poised on the brink of civil war. Only the Soviet Union held out against the near global post-war Pax Americana, intent on exporting an ideological alternative to liberalism and building its own empire. Those were the circumstances that vaulted the U.S. to a position of unparalleled global preeminence. By 89, not a single one of them had remained. By then, however, the conviction that preeminence had become an American birthright had long since taken root in Washington. The fall of the Berlin Wall, an event occasioning great celebration but minimal reflection, seemingly ratified the exertions and sacrifices of the previous several decades. And we're going to be taking a look at Fukuyama's book as well. Now, the connection here is always with Fukuyama. Fukuyama did an interview with the last book that I reviewed, which was about Islam. Fukuyama did an interview with that guy. And Fukuyama here, I would really love to see him talk to this guy, Andrew Bacevich.
He needed the kind of political recognition that he's gotten now as president of the United States. A little hard to say that, but here we are. So he's really the reason that I wrote this book. There is there are obvious threats to democracy in the form of a rising China, an authoritarian Russia. The most surprising and the most challenging threats, though, are the ones that are coming from inside democracies, where you have these populist movements.
If that ever happens. If I ever get my own show and I can invite my own guests. With the passing of the Cold War, an opportunity to create a bigger and better Pax Americana presented itself. After decades of conflict and competition, only a single superpower remained. Assertive U.S. global leadership was therefore more important than ever. That the nation possessed the wherewithal to fulfill that role was a given. no conceivable alternatives enlisted. Much like Schlechinger's old order in 32, however, the new order was running on fumes. The evidence was everywhere: in appalling economic inequality, seemingly intraceable racism, social disintegration, mushrooming personal indebtedness, budgeting deficits, trade imbalances, and, above all, a loss of faith in the American system. For a nation deeply committed to remaining the world's leading military power, especially telling was the disparity between the munificent resources funneled to the Pentagon and the largely ruinous results actually achieved by U.S. interventions abroad, which became more frequent and more expensive as the Cold War receded into the past. Another recent Real News interview was about how the CIA and the Pentagon have just failed in their foreign policy over and over and over again. But honestly, if they fail over and over and over again, it doesn't seem like that's a failure. To me, it just seems like we are misjudging what the actual goals of these organizations are. Put to the test, the assumptions underlying post-Cold War expectations of the U.S. continuing to exercise global leadership and thereby defining the future, the outlook expressed by Madeleine Albright, did not hold up. Yet, much as Detroit kept right on calling itself the Motor City even while bleeding market share to European and Japanese automakers, Washington remained in deep denial. In that regard, the election of 2016 mirrored the election of 32. Rather than nursing the status quo any further, the voters who installed Trump in Oval Office were counting on him to chart a new course. In truth, neither Roosevelt nor Trump possessed a clear understanding of where such a new course might lead. Both presidents flew by the seat of their pants. Inauguration Day 33 approach, Schlesinger wrote, FDR was calm and inscrutable, confident that American improvisation could meet the future on its own terms. Calm was never Trump's MO, but improvisation bordering on whimsy was to become a signature or a nightmare of his administration. Oh God, we went through 4 years of just whatever Trump was thinking that day. We all, the fucking whole country, the whole fucking earth had to follow what this guy was thinking that day. It was fucking terrible. Go Feifei. Oh God, dude. With the troubles that swept across the American landscape during the summer of 2020 made unmistakably clear, however, was that further improvisation wouldn't do. Trump's presidency signified the final demise of the new order. As to what should replace it, he was plainly clueless. Candidate Biden's attempt to finesse the question by vowing to restore American position as the leader of the free world possessed about as much relevance as President Trump's own mid-February 2020 assurances that with the advent of warmer weather, COVID-19 was sure to disappear. That's basically what this whole BRIC versus NATO thing is happening right now. Like it or not, the next order is upon us. Identifying its parameters can no longer be postponed, and that means having done with American exceptionalism once and for all. History for the next order. To facilitate a timely transition to the next order, Americans should heed the counsel of Pope Francis and recover their memory. At least with regards to race, the events of 2020 did prompt such a recovery. A seemingly endless series of incidents in which police officers attacked black citizens provoked widespread outrage that transcended racial lines. As a direct consequence, many Americans, by no means at all, rediscovered racism. As never before, white privilege now emerged as a seemingly indelible stain on the nation's soul. In the realm of American international politics, the counterpart of white privilege is American privilege. In common with great powers of the past and present, the U.S. habitually asserts the prerogative of judging its behavior on a global stage in accordance with its own preferred and eminently flexible standards. There was a recent quote from a lady, I forgot her name. She says that it wasn't white people that took over the world. It was imperialism that took over the world. It was specific imperialism that took over the world. It's not the people. It's imperial. And then they use the people to kind of retroactively justify this and have a casus belli that is acceptable to their own nation. But that doesn't mean that absolutely everyone benefits from the imperialism, right? In fact, most people don't. It's just a more advanced form of exploiting surplus capital from another, exploit a little bit of surplus capital from your own population and a lot from the external population. And that's what a lot of these international people are, international students or international workers. They come here, it's all about passing the buck of the exploitation of surplus labor, right? Right now, for example, in Vancouver, you can get a rental home. That rental home belongs to a foreigner. Some guy signs a contract for 1 year for that home. And then once he does that, he basically Airbnbs the place or, rents it out room by room and then tries to exploit the surplus capital there. So it's just all passing the buck. It's just moving that exploitation of surplus capital to the next guy, to whoever's less educated, the next guy. The whole system is corrupt of exploitation and then justification of that exploitation. The question is, between capitalists and communists, the main question is, does a manager, does he add value or does he exploit value for his workers? Well, obviously it depends on the manager, but at the end of the day, if you look at the whole chain, there is still another form of great chain that's happening. It's just a capitalist exploitation great chain. And who are at the top of the great chain? All the people with professional degrees, from psychologists, right? And this is a great example because the people with professional degrees, they charge $100 for a psychology session for, people that are more or less well-to-do, that they can pay that $100 for a psychology session. But who are the real psychologists of our society? Well, they're the service workers that get paid much less and are actually dealing with the psychological ramifications of, homeless people, McDonald's workers and, restaurant workers or, people working in the front lines who have to deal with, a homeless shelter being opened up next to your small business, right? Those small businesses are the ones who are having to deal with the actual psychology of the people. The real psychologists, people with professional degrees, they don't have to actually deal with them, right? The people with professional degrees are the whole credentialism of our society is really funny, which is something that is also kind of undermined by, again, I think this influx of Chinese international students or international students in general, and this everybody getting a bachelor's degree, everybody needing a master's degree in the next 10 years to be able to get a job, right? It's just this